Today we are hosting a very outstanding woman here on DW Africa. I'm speaking of the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Dr. Amina Jane Mohammed, who's been pushing the Sustainable Development Goals agenda in Africa and beyond. Good evening, Dr. Mohammed. How are you doing?
Good evening. It's wonderful to be with you.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us here on DW Africa today. So we just want to speak to you about the SDG. How is it going on your side?
Well, today we are the curtain raiser to the UN's General Assembly, which happens for about 2 weeks. And that curtain raiser was us starting the decade of action towards the SDGs. So we had an SDG moment in which our system was able to show the status of the SDGs, and then a response from member states, heads of state and government, and stakeholders in how they were going to engage to see the delivery of these goals by 2030. So good discussion.
All right, but speaking about you as a woman, African society is patriarchal. Women in your position are few. Is your voice being heard the way you want it to be heard?
It's being heard, but maybe not the way I want it to be heard. And I think that my position here is it's humbling. It's an honor to have this level and this platform. So what I try to do is to amplify my voice from the United Nations as an individual, but collectively through the many African women that this Secretary General has put at the helm of affairs in different agencies and programs of the UN. So it's not just about me as an African woman, it's about the African women, and it's also about those who have Africa in their heart and work for Africa every day from the United Nations.
And you are the 5th Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and you're pushing the Sustainable Development Goals. Can you explain exactly what SDGs are?
Well, first of all, I was privileged to be in a position where we helped to shape the 17 goals, and it took us 4 years to really consider what the former Secretary General Kofi Annan had put in place, the Millennium Development Goals. And with the Sustainable Development Goals, we decided that this needed to be what member states saw as a response to their challenges across the world, and not just an issue of North versus South, but we the people, for which the UN stands, and that sustainable development should be seen at the core of our economies, where we consider the environment, where we also consider inclusion and inequality. So, inclusive economies that are green and that are built on strong institutions and the recognition that human rights is at the center. 17 goals which represent this. The first 6 goals you'll see are the unfinished business of the MDGs, on poverty, on hunger, on gender, on health, education, water and sanitation. And then you'll come to the next set of goals, which I would say 7 of them are really about the economy. And it talks about cities, it talks about renewable energy, it talks about consumption and production, the way we produce in this world, climate action, and what happens in the ocean and on land. And then it hangs together because we have to sit on very strong pillars of strong institutions and the rule of law in Goal 16, and Goal 17 are partnerships. So it's a collection of actions that need to be taken, where our governments need to invest so that everyone has a life of dignity, in short. And that's where we are.
All right. Health is also one of the goals, Sustainable Development Goals, that you're obviously looking at. And so what has your office done to try and assist Africa in the fight against COVID-19?
Well, first of all, recognizing that when we want to try to stop the transmission, that we've got to take care of our frontline workers in health, the majority of which are women in Africa, and to get as much as possible everything to the front line. So the UN has been delivering to different countries across the continent PPEs, test kits, all the things that you will need to try to suppress the virus on the health side. But we're also reinforcing the call and the need to make sure that tackling COVID doesn't mean that we stop giving health care for women who are giving birth, or children, or normal vaccine programs that we have. That's the danger. and we want to do all of it. That, of course, needs resources. And so in addition, we're using our platform to convene to make sure resources are available for stimulus packages and filling the gaps, the financial gaps that many of our countries have.
All right, Dr. Mohammed, is it not a leap to talk about sustainable development in Africa when we have very few strong economies on the continent? Of course, bearing in mind that there was also once Millennium Development Goals that failed in 2015. So how do you intend to achieve these sustainable development goals looking at the economy in Africa right now?
Well, first, every one life that is saved in childbirth, one child that can go to school is not a failure. So I would never recognize the MDGs as a failure. I would say that we did the best we could. It wasn't enough. And what we got was a successor set of goals, which built on the fact that goals do make you come together and focus on investments that are needed. And I think with the African continent, the African Union has been a partner where we have aligned the 2030 agenda with the 2063 agenda. So the Common Free Trade Agreement, for instance, is a core part of how we will support the leveraging of resources that will look to invest in that within countries and across borders. And this is about economies that actually in Africa have been growing, not fast enough, not catching up with our populations or with the needs that we have in the way we want to, but certainly they have made some inroads, and we do know what the problem is, we do know what the solutions are, but we have to have the political will internally within our countries, on the continent as an African Union, but also in the international community. If we have genuine partnerships in the international community, then they will see Africa as a collaboration and not a handout. And that, I think, is the change that has to happen. The step change that needs to happen is that people see Africa as a partner, collaborating in what is in everyone's enlightened interest in an interconnected world, for every boat to be at the same level. As they say, boats rising, are they doing it at the same level?
All right, so amongst these 17 goals, which one would you say is lagging behind?
Well, that's a difficult question because these are all so interconnected. In every case, there is a lag. We are not on track as a collective of the SDGs before COVID. So how do we take COVID and make sure that we take the opportunity of reinforcing the investments that are needed to do this? We're not on track. We made a lot of efforts on education, on poverty, even on gender equality. But there is still a way to go in reducing the violence against women, for instance. There's still a way to go in reducing to the minimum on child mortality and maternal mortality. Having children in school, which now is a really big crisis because they're out with the lockdowns, but making sure they have a quality education, the curriculum and the skill sets are fit for the continent and its the economies that it wants to grow. So I wouldn't say any one particular is further behind. I think all are challenged. And you have to remember this set of goals are different in each country. Africa is not a country, it's a continent of very many economies. And each one is got a different level. Each one is different in its response. Even within a country, the way you respond to education. If I take my country, Nigeria, for instance, the education indices in the north of the country are very far behind the south. So that could pull the country down as a whole on aggregate with education. But if we pull up the north, then we're going to get a better aggregate for Nigeria. It's the same if you take Africa as a continent and you look at the aggregate figure. It may look as though we're failing, but within it, you see some successes, and those are the ones that we need to build on so it catches across the continent.
And so what are the effects of SDGs on poverty reduction in Africa?
Well, the first, I think, is realizing that poverty is inextricably linked to inequalities, and to really try to see how our heads of state and government are looking at those budgets to make sure that the data will tell you where everyone is, no matter who they are, and that you're investing equally in education access, in health access, and that there are not these huge inequalities that we see with people in the rural area and people in the urban centers. That has to change. And I think that the more we get the data to bear these issues open, the better. Making the connection to a lack of investment in poverty also, the instability we see in our countries across the continent, has a lot to do with the lack of investment in people and the levels of poverty, of hunger, of inequality. So that the root causes to many of the things that we are asking about, whether it is gender inequality, all has to be about empowerment and sharing those resources more equitably, and ensuring that there is justice for everyone.
All right, speaking of gender equality, what has changed in the roles of women in leadership?
I think sadly in Africa, at the very helm of affairs, where our presidents and our heads of government are, we only have the one president in Ethiopia, and she's an amazing woman, but she is only one. And what we need to see is that if you're not the president, you should be the vice president. There needs to be partnership in leading a nation or on an issue. I think we're doing a little bit better in some of our cabinets, not necessarily in the numbers in terms of equality, but in the portfolios that we're holding. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of how many women health ministers we have, how many women finance ministers we have, how many women agric ministers that we have. We are in some very strong portfolios, and the African Union has set up a really good initiative that is trying to groom African women leaders across the continent. We are very far behind if I was to talk about our leadership. But I think that, our voice is being heard much better than it was before. I have enormous hope in the young generation and the young women leaders that I am seeing. They're just amazing. They're not waiting for government. They're not waiting for anyone to tell them how to do it or where to do it. They are rising. But we have to open up the spaces. We have to invest in them, and make sure that when we say, youth are the largest cohort, they are the most important resource, then how are we investing in that to make sure they realize their potentials? So work to do. We have a decade to really get this done. And I'm confident that we can do it. There's not a reason why we can't, but there's every reason why we should.
All right, Dr. Mohammed, obviously we can't wrap up this interview without talking about the youths. UN is 75 years. What is the acceptance like amongst youths in terms of the organization United Nations?
Well, we've had an amazing conversation. As UN was becoming 75, the decision of the Secretary General was to take the conversation to young people, and to ask them what it was they wanted in a multilateral organization like ours. Surprisingly little information and real understanding of how we work. We are a complex institution, but we're owned by member states. But the beginning of our charter is we the people. And so that question to young people has really started to see the answers that they have been given is to have a more inclusive institution, a more responsive institution to their issues, and perhaps, one that really addresses the peace and security of the world in a better way, holding leaders to account. How do you make the UN work better for peace and security? There's a number of questions that they ask because they can't understand why we don't do it. Why we have, a Security Council and a General Assembly and the paraphernalia of government, and yet we don't make the inroads that they feel need to happen almost immediately in some cases. Life is a little bit more complex than that. The reality is often not where it should be. The aspirations are very ambitious and noble. And I think the job of we at 75 in the UN is to try to transform better, so that we can begin to close that gap